Hi, welcome to episode 42 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we all live in, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, here in Brooklyn, New York, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Kirk Benshoff, who also lives in Brooklyn. Kirk is a graphic designer and has worked in the publishing industry for over 20 years. He's worked on graphic novels, magazines, logos, illustrations, websites, and lots of other things I'm sure we'll get into. Kirk, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Thanks for having me. My story. How far back do you want me to go?
Well, the big challenge here is you can't do this graphically. You're gonna have to talk it out.
I know, right?
Well,
That
how'd you
is the
get
challenge.
started? Like, did you grow up always either loving comic books or loving drawing? Like, what was your pathway into this?
I always had a creative side to my personality, but I don't think I really had any focus. Really, it was just something I always did on the side. My parents always nurtured that aspect of it, which I'll forever be grateful for them of doing. And it wasn't until I was applying to college that somebody's like, no, you should look at graphic design. I was like, all right. And so I just kind of, applied to a graphic design program and fell in love with it and ended up going to a university that kind of talked about the ethos of graphic design. Like, this is what you do and this is how you do certain things, but they didn't really drill into specific industries. So when I left, I just explored different industries for about a decade. And, I was just bouncing around, worked in advertising, worked in magazine publishing. I worked for a toy company, just everything you could imagine. And then eventually made my way into book publishing. And then that was my aha moment there. And so, I mean, I've been very lucky. Things kind of fell into place that allowed me to kind of find my road. And so it's been good.
What was the aha moment for you to get into and stay in publishing?
Um, it's a good question. I always worked in areas so that I always bounced around jobs that I wanted to make sure that I enjoyed what I was doing. And so, whether it was, um, what do you call it? Whether it was the subject matter or I appreciated the mission that the company had or whatever it was. But as soon as I lost interest, then I was like, all right, I got to find another job. So at the time, like it was about like maybe a month or 2 months that I would, or like a year or 2 years that I would go and work with the company and then want to leave. Um, and a lot of places also had like very toxic cultures. But once I landed in book publishing, there was something about the ingredients that just kept me in it. I loved what I was doing. I loved I loved what we were making. We were making books, like, just there was nothing negative about that. And the projects kept being fresh and so on and so forth. So it was the kind of thing that after a while, like suddenly I blinked and I was like, oh crap, it's 10 years. How did that happen? You know?
Wow. Did you start off with graphic novels, or were you doing like, I don't know, like cover art or something like that first? Like,
So in my industry for design is going to be doing, cover art. You're doing the spine, the back cover, and depending on what part of the industry you're in, you're actually designing the interior of the book. So I started in children's publishing, and in children's publishing, you get to basically work on the entire book, exterior and interior, as a whole. So so if it's a prose book, you're figuring out like what the margins are going to be, where the folio is going to sit, where the running head's going to be, what the chapter openers are going to look like. Is there interior art? Then you work with an artist and art direct the interior art. And then when you hit the right time, then you're going to art direct the cover and put that together. and you kind of work on like the book as a whole. And then other once you start kind of ebbing into adult, a lot of that stuff has been sort of templated these days. So interiors are templated, so you're pretty much just working on jackets and trade paperback covers. But I basically worked in children's, and then started working at a Japanese manga imprint. Then the Japanese manga imprint was restructured under a sci-fi fantasy imprint. So I did that for a number. So I straddled manga and sci-fi fantasy for a number of years. Then made my way back into children's, and then doing a little bit of comics. But then now I'm full time comics again. So
Okay.
it's comics been my thread now for
Hmm.
a very, very, very long time.
And did you collect comic book yourself when you were growing
Oh
up?
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh
What were
yeah.
your favorite comic books?
Oh my gosh, whatever I could get my hands on. I was obsessed with X-Men, Wolverine. I loved Spider-Man, Batman. I loved at the time, like we were small town Massachusetts, so there weren't a lot of comic shops or places that sold them. There was like maybe two, but then they went out of business. So it was like anytime I went into a store, I was like searching for comics, and I found them in the weirdest places. Like there was a, a Child World toy store that had like a small comic section that I would get stuff. Found like a great GI Joe comic. It was like amazing, and then like I used this guy tried to open a baseball card shop in town, and he sold like these kind of random comic section. So I was constantly trying to get them wherever I could. But there wasn't like a place that I could get them on a regular basis, or at least like follow a series on a regular basis. So I would get like, you know, 20, volumes in a row, but then all of a sudden it would just end. Or I would just, it was like very piecemealed, but I loved it. God, I loved it. As my mom used to always tell me, she's like, if I could only read real books instead of my comic books. I was like, man.
Well, it's where it's worked out okay. Which
Well, it did. I know. I kind of, I have to, remind, I'm like, I'm making a living doing them now.
yeah, touche.
I know, right? They got me
Yeah.
somewhere.
I remember I think I'm a little older than you. I remember collecting like at my heyday of collecting comics. I think I was like 1982 to like
Mm,
84, maybe a little younger. So I've got like the Frank Miller Daredevils, and I have like
mm.
X-Men and like 140s, 150s, 160s, and thankfully I did save them all. I don't know that they're worth anything, but there's definitely like a wave of nostalgia that
Oh
comes
yeah.
out when I like read those things and like smell them and feel the crackle of the papers and stuff. It's very satisfying.
Oh yeah. I'll love that smell of the old paper and all that stuff. It's forever very satisfying.
Yeah, and also the advertising is very like kitschy. Like there'll be like an ad for like the Atlas, like how to work out and get that like strong body. Like there's still stuff that's almost cringy, but it's so dated and like adorable. Or like ads for like video games, like the
Oh yeah.
Space Invaders in 1982. Like this is like cutting edge stuff, or the Star Wars for Star Wars Atari video games, and it looks just absurdly simplistic.
Oh my god, I'll never forget the X-ray glasses. I totally got a pair of the X-ray glasses, and I'll never forget how brilliant they were, because it was just a pair of paper glasses with a small circle cut, and they took red thread and then put the thread right next to each other. So when you held your hand, it kind of doubled your vision. And then it looked like you're like, and where the vision doubled, it looked like you were seeing the bone inside your hand. That's brilliant. Maybe a little gypped, but it was brilliant.
That's funny. And so were you? So then, were you drawing like when you were like in high school? Were you artistic? Were you drawing? Were you painting? Did you know that you were going to be studying graphic arts in college, or how did you end up going down that pathway?
I mean, I was drawing and painting. Again, not with a lot of focus. I mean, it's funny because in the latter years in my life, I got into DJing. And it's funny because I really got into it. I played instruments when I was a kid, but I really got into DJing because I liked this idea of, taking music and putting the parts together to create a whole new experience. And in essence, that's kind of like what my career is like I'm taking parts of, an illustration that someone created with a font that someone else created, and then maybe some, you know, ornamentation or something that I created, and start pushing it and pulling it and, changing the color and creating a new experience with these elements. And it's funny because it's like I was consuming so much. I watched like a embarrassing amount of television as a kid, and between that and magazines, just read like just like loved magazines. It was like that skateboarding magazine that like I just was obsessed with. I can't remember the name of, and it was either that or National Geographics. I just loved flipping through those. It was just like anything that like just triggered this some emotional response to me. MTV at the time was so revolutionary, and it just triggered, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Like, why was it eliciting an emotional response? But I just kept wanting to experience that. But again, like I had no focus. I didn't know how to reproduce that. I didn't know how to contribute to that. I just loved creating something, whatever that was, and then consuming it. And then it wasn't until I was in college and then really, out of college and working in New York, where all of a sudden these pieces started coming together, and I started realizing like, oh, so this is the larger picture. This is what everything is. And so it was cool. There was something driving me on towards a path. I just wasn't really entirely sure what that was,
Mm.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you were talking about how much television you were watching and all the comic books, and your mother wanted you to read, and you're making me a little bit uncomfortable because it sounds a lot like what me and my wife might say to our kids, and thinking that's going to be the end of the world, and apparently it turns out okay because I'm sure if your mother listened in to maybe what you say as well to your kids, but certainly what we say, there's a certain level of anxiety that comes
Oh yeah.
into play as a parent that maybe is overblown. But when I don't really do much preparation for this, but when I was thinking about comic books and thinking about TikTok, which my daughter loves and my kids are on all the time, um, I started thinking that there might be like parallels, and I was like, I think I remember like in the 50s there was a movement to like ban comic books or clamp down or
Mm.
censor them,
Oh yeah.
and like I look up that there was this book called like Seduction of the Innocent by this guy Frederick Wortham or something, and like the whole claim was basically like comic books were evil and contributed to delinquency and perversion,
Oh yeah.
and it was part of a communist conspiracy. So I wonder like how much would you say like if we say comic books of the 50s, is TikTok of the 2020s similar to the comic books of the 1950s or
So wait.
MTV of the 1980s?
No, that's a thing. I think the TikTok, I think, really is was designed and created to be manipulative. And there's like inherently, it's a format that's um that's just you know uh almost like media that's designed to be a drug. And not to say that there isn't any benefit to it, but in terms of in-depth meaningful story, it's very hard to do that in the time limit that TikTok provides you. uh Sequential art as a whole to me is just another format of communicating. Like you have prose, you have sequential art, and people process information differently. And I think that's just inherently one of the things that's beautiful about the format, is that somebody who's not necessarily going to pick up like a 400-page biography on Einstein could pick up like a 300-page graphic novel on Einstein, get the same information, and they're probably more apt to read the graphic novel because that's something that their brain is going to interpret better. Um, but because of what happened in sort of the early America uh, attacks on the format, it really hindered American publishing, because really American publishing after that, like a lot of imprints went out of business. The only ones that survived were doing superhero comics, and then after that, that was what everybody's association of comics were like, oh, they're just superhero comics, they're just for kids.
Yeah.
But you go anywhere else in the world, comics are, they're just another format. You go to France, like comics in France are huge. There's a, you know, in Japan, comics are
Yeah.
huge. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a whole sommelier series in Japan,
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
just
Yeah.
teaches you
Drops
about
of
wine.
God. Drops of
Yeah,
God. I have the four that were printed in English. I have those.
that's awesome. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and it's like, and it's a, I think in America we're trying to break through that, that glass ceiling of that was set all those many years ago. And I think that's the big challenge. And I mean, we're breaking through. I mean, um, you
Was it
know,
only
uh,
in America? Was it only America that kind of had that reaction to comic books?
I think so. I mean,
Really?
and I'm sure there's somebody out there who could correct me, but I mean, as far as I know, America is really the place that had the knee jerk reaction and ostracized it for what it, for moral grounds or whatever it was. But you go all over the world, and countries are publishing comics, and it's being read beyond just kids who want to read Batman and superheroes. Like it's there's content that's covering horror comics, there's suspense detective comics, there's just a plethora of nonfiction work out there. um I mean, one of the most incredible series that we published when I was at the manga imprint was it was a series called With the Light, and it was all about a young autistic boy. And so the very first volume was the boy being born, and the entire series is literally his life up until the last book, and it's his death as an adult. So it's just, but it's a very heartwarming, beautiful story, just kind of talking about what it's like being autistic and kind of breaking through stereotypes and assumptions. And so it's cool. There's so much you can do with the format and so much you can experience, but people in the US are starting to like really, you know see it for that.
Yeah. Um. While I have you here, are there any like, I guess, like any graphic novels or series that you're a fan of, like the non superhero genre? I guess we'll focus on, I guess, for adults or for teens that you recommend.
There's some recent ones.
And I asked this because, like, I've gone to Kinokuniya, where I'm like, oh, like, I lived in Japan for 3 years and I'd love to take a look, but I don't even know where to start. It's just overwhelming. So that's why I ask you, is how does somebody sink their teeth into this if they're curious? Like, what's a good starting point?
That's hard. And I mean, honestly, that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we are having, in that for, like, early reader through middle grade through young adult, it's easy to find stuff. There's a lot of, publishing in that space has been very robust, especially in the past, decade. And there's a lot of really, great stuff coming out. It's the adult market that it's hard to break into, and discoverability is the biggest difficulty, because you go into, like, you go into a shop and you're thinking like, gosh, I'd really like to find a cool nonfiction title. None of the shelves are set up for you to find a nonfiction title. So it gets hard, and then you're looking at all these spines that look beautiful. There's so many beautiful books out there, but like, how do you go And unless you're pulling books off the shelf one by one, and then like you could spend hours in there, and you may or may not find something that appeals to you. So I think it's the adult market that's the hardest. Like it's when you look at graphic novels in that space, most places you have to know what you're getting and then zero in. And then not a lot of places are covering, like New Yorker and New York Times, cover stuff every once in a while, but they tend to favor certain imprints. Um, so it's hard. I think it's one of these things that as an industry we're trying to figure that out. But in terms of really great books out there, Drawn and Quarterly uh, has a very consistent selection of books that are just really interesting and very intimate. They're very intimate portraits into people's lives. Kate Beaton just wrote Ducks, which is just absolutely incredible. Um, our imprint for Second, we've been I love their ethos of just trying to push the boundaries of things to put out, and we have a couple new titles. One's called Accidental Czar. It's written by Andrew Weiss and illustrated or art by Brian Brown, and it's actually all on Vladimir Putin. And Andrew Weiss is the U.S. government's kind of premier expert on Russian policy. So it's just like, if there's anybody who's going to write about Putin, it's going to be Andrew. Um, we have another book, Now Let Me Fly, written by Ron Wemberly, and I'm always pronouncing his name incorrectly, but art by Bram Raval. Uh, but it's on the oh gosh, my brain. Hold on a second. I have to. This is what happens when I start forgetting everything. It's a Eugene Bullard, and but it's just this incredible story of this man, this Black American man who just has the most absolutely incredible life, and just so much accomplishment at a time when it was very difficult to be Black in America, and then ends his life, as an elevator operator in New York City. And so it's just a very beautiful story, kind of shedding a light on something that like 90% of the people out there don't even know about. So that's why I love these. I mean, it's just they're it's just it's, you know always an incredible experience.
Yeah. Now, do you find that do graphic novels, and you kind of alluded to this before, but do graphic novels take away from like the written novel, or are they really kind of just building an audience? Like, are you cannibalizing one form for the other, or just kind of addressing people who wouldn't have read it all?
I don't think it's cannibal. I think it's broadening an experience. I mean, if somebody does a graphic novel adaptation of I have some oh yeah, To Kill a Mockingbird. Right.
I have
Like it's
that
like
too.
someone does like it does that. It's like you're never gonna beat the prose edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful, and incredible experience. But a lot of these stories, they're trying to tell you something, and that message can be also conveyed in sequential art form. So the adaptations, they're never a substitute, but they do open a message to more people. But I think for me, um, it's really about the whole thing is the you know original content for comics. I think is really the thing that people really need to embrace, because the fundamental structure of the format is ultimately what's so interesting. Um, I can ramble on this for hours. So
No,
just
but well,
tell me if you,
we have about an hour.
they have, I corrected myself earlier because I was about to call somebody an illustrator. And like, to me, it's like when you talk about a graphic novel, the person's not illustrating it, they're doing art for it. And there's a distinction there because if I'm working on a book cover or I'm doing art for a magazine or I'm doing interior art for a book, that artwork is illustrated around the text. So whatever that text is, that drives the artwork. The thing about a graphic novel is that the art and the text are interdependent of each other. They hold equal weight. So the art is actually the other half of the storytelling. So it's not illustrating anything. The art is actually telling the story along with the text. And that's an important distinction. And when someone is creating, what I think is cool is that you then have to, like, a really good artist, there's so many incredible artists out there that what they're doing is they're illustrating, nonverbal communication. And there's a really interesting thing where you have to be able to understand nonverbal, like expressions. So if somebody's looking worried, that's part of the storytelling. A graphic novel is not going to explicitly say, well, John was worried when he walked into the room. Like, they're going to show John looking worried as he's walking into the room. And I think that's what makes them unique, is that you're exercising different muscles than just, reading lines of text. You're needing to understand visual cues, visual signifiers to understand what's going on. And, to be honest, it's maybe a skill that needs to be adopted more these days to, understand that, like, someone might be in distress, or, or read a situation when they walk into a room or something.
Well, but it's interesting you say that, because I think, to me, the other part of it is that I think if you become more aware of the nonverbal communication, one, I think that there's, as an aside about this, I think that, to your point, there are some people who just aren't going to be into reading for
Right.
whatever reason. So your medium is another way of communicating and telling stories. But the other part is, I think we need to be aware of how people can subliminally communicate to us, with not necessarily even nefarious, but in other ways, like for selling things to you, right? Like, it's
Right.
you're and I think those are things which people aren't even aware of. And it got me, one of the things that I was thinking about is why it's so kind of, like, I think, useful for you to be on here to talk, is that my perception of things is that we're becoming a more visual society because screens are so much more ubiquitous. So that's going to become a higher priority in terms of communicating, in terms of how you express yourself, but also
Mm-hmm.
understanding how people are going to try to influence and manipulate you. And
Mm-hmm.
we've seen that already with, like, politics and everything, about how images can be manipulated and can be triggering.
Totally. And I think, it's interesting because a lot of what's coming out right now is very, I'm trying to find the right word, a non-triggering word. Um, a lot of what's coming out right now in all formats, in, sequential art format to prose to picture books, is a window into to the intimate world around us, to everybody who you're interacting with. It could be, a story about a person who's making a living doing, deliveries, to, a person, an indigenous teenager growing up out west, to, um, somebody who's trying to find themselves, post college. Like, and what I love about, the type of stories that are coming out, and in the various formats, like, you're seeing them, these stories written in, in comics, you're seeing them written in prose. It's so much more than what we ever had when we were kids. It was like, I remember being thrown books when I was a kid saying, like, this is required reading. And like I'm sure Beckett is respected in lots of circles. I hated that book. It was difficult to read. It did not stick with me whatsoever. But what's happening is with the publishing that's coming out right now, you really are getting an opportunity to learn about people in a way that you otherwise wouldn't. And then in the various ways, like, there's so many topics covered in picture books. Immediately, kids are, you know, able to learn about what would otherwise be a difficult conversation in a very approachable way. And they're exercising language and visual skills. And then as they get older, there's publishing that's following that, and it's just absolutely incredible. And I tell my kids this all the time: you guys are a hell of a lot smarter than I was when I was your age, and you guys are just getting smarter. And
Yeah.
it's very humbling, but it's exciting.
Yeah, yeah, they're definitely I think exposed to more, and I think even you're like to the point about TikTok. I think to me, I don't like my son Atticus, our youngest, actually oftentimes will say like, "Dad, did you know this or did you know that?" And it's always his source is
Mm,
TikTok. I think to me the nefarious part of TikTok is that like you can get that constant hit, like it's over and
right,
over. Not that there isn't good information out there, but it's the whole like it's the process, not the substance that's
right,
necessarily bad. It's the process that's going to make you get the bad substance.
right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like nobody's getting, you're not hooked on getting like really interesting things over and over again. It's the low hanging, lowest common denominator stuff
right,
that you waste your time with. But
right,
but the same could be said for like for comic books and books and stuff. Is that there's lots of stuff out there that probably isn't necessarily the best, and that goes for anything. Like you mentioned before, I don't know if it was on the podcast before we talked, but like I watched a lot of Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch and
right.
Three's Company. And as much as I want to kind of put down, TikTok, that stuff was not exactly redeeming. And I know you didn't need to blame the communists for that. That was just good old American capitalism.
True. I think the difference though is the substance of the information that you're getting. And I think that's the ultimate difference. It's right. It is that, like, whatever the time limit is for TikTok. What is it, like 30 seconds or 45 seconds or something like that? I don't know, but it's like you can only communicate so much. And with that limitation, can you do beautiful things? Yes, of course. Absolutely. But I think the danger with formats like TikTok or even Twitter, like like there was like that character limit with Twitter. I don't know, do they still have that?
I think it maybe
um
expanded, but I think there was still a limit.
but you have like a character limit on it, but then people engage in like very deep like important conversations that require more than that character limit. And I think that's where I struggle with it is, for television or film or books, or whatever, you can create a meaningful dialogue. You can create a meaningful case on something in the like in a half an hour to 2 hours to what can fit between two pieces of board. I just think that those mediums get dangerous because people start to use them for topics that should be saved for like a proper coherent conversation, and you
Yeah.
can't have a proper coherent conversation. Like if it was just like Neil deGrasse Tyson doing like a 30-second like fun fact every day, yeah, that's awesome. But it's like what I don't like is like tackling
Complicated
deep
issues.
societal you
Yeah.
know
Yeah. Yeah.
conversations.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, also understanding that whatever facts might be presented to you, you need
Yeah,
to do you. And it sounds so trite to do your own research, but to like understand that that's one viewpoint, and that goes both ways. Like I stopped subscribing to the New York Times because I felt like everything that I was getting from them was kind of skewed one direction. And I'm not talking about necessarily political. I'm talking more like kind of class wise. So I just stopped reading it.
right. Yeah,
But
I mean, I think it's everything's about preference and what you're looking to get out of it. But I think it is also important to I tend to be a read everything, experience everything kind of person, and but I also am one to support, like sort of like the responsible side of all of that stuff. And so it's I think it's that's the thing. I think media literacy is probably one of the biggest things that um uh is needed. And and one of those things that actually we're actually working on a graphic novel that is on media literacy. So whether it is TikTok or it is Instagram or Facebook or whatever, how do you filter out that information? How do you vet your sources? How do you take that information, but then put it in a context um of sorry, losing my train of thought here.
Hmm.
Like, how do you collect that information and then put it together in such a way that is going to be, meaningful, where like you can take everything and then make your best judgment from that? I think a lot of it is people tend to inadvertently, uh, you know, collect their sources that match their point of view, and so they're not necessarily veering to better understand what other people are trying to communicate. Sorry, that did not
Yeah.
come out as nearly as clearly as I wanted it to. So I'd say, so it's like it's basically a situation of I try to, whether I'm reading something on Fox News or if I'm reading something on the New York Post or if I'm reading something in the Washington Post to New York Times to the Boston Globe to Gothamist, website, try to take everything with a grain of salt, but understand sort of the underlying issue that's there. But I think that's a thing that's like not necessarily taught and communicated.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a very I took a very wide turn there, and I don't know where my car went. So
That's all right. Well, I'll ask you this. One of one of the things that I think has been gnawing at me of late is, and this is weird for me to say this because I grew up on Marvel comic books and loved, like I said, Daredevil and X-Men, and I had the I just had all the all the ones that I think were popular, most popular when we were younger. But I'm a little annoyed with like comic books and with Marvel movies, and
mm,
what piques me or what irks me, I guess, is that there's like this the idea of a superhero also kind of is the idea that you can't do anything the superheroes need to do. There are problems that we
right.
as regular people can't deal with. So we need to let the superheroes deal with it and fight the other supervillains. And I feel like that kind of captures almost like the ethos of like the political arena, because it's like, well, no, regular people can't do anything. You need an Obama, you need a Ruth Bader Ginsburg, or on the other side, you need
Mm.
a Donald Trump, or you need Mitch McConnell, because regular people are powerless to deal with this. You need me. And I think that, and it's overthinking this, I'm sure, but I think that one of the things that the superhero cult kind of, I think, reinforces in a bad sense is this idea that you need superheroes. Because I think that one of the things we all need to take back is the idea that we do have power. We need to take that back, that we can influence things. We don't need superheroes.
It's interesting. I was thinking about that at one point, and it's funny. I think the way my brain was thinking about is we need to expand our definition of superheroes, because in these books, superheroes are always these people that are stopping the asteroid that's going to hit the Earth, or this ethereal being that's trying to destroy the universe, or God knows what. But I think we need to expand the definition of superhero to like people like Stacey Abrams. Like, you are a superhero. You are an everyday person who did astounding things, and that's awesome. And like, like the teachers that are, working, people use that term loosely, but I think like we have to, there are people who are doing a lot, and people don't necessarily understand how much that they're doing. Like,
Right.
I've talked to somebody recently who's a teacher, and they told me about how, like, what their days are like during the school year, and I could not do that.
Yeah.
I just physically could not do that whatsoever. It is so intense and it requires so much work, and it's and emotional drive. And that's why I think it's important for people to learn about what people like that are doing, whether it's a teacher or a nurse, or you know a, a congressperson
Firefighter
or a
or
firefighter, like what they're doing in a day, like
yeah.
how intense that is. And then like these are superheroes. Like you have to appreciate that.
Yeah, and there, I forget the guy's name, but the guy who almost died on the football field on Monday, and I just started hearing they just started the name of the I guess the trainer who saved his life is just starting to like I just heard about it on the radio like yesterday, and that got me thinking about it like kind of like that the idea of a hero, and they're saying it, but it's still on a field where everybody else is getting paid millions, tens of millions of
Right.
dollars. The hero is the guy who's probably only making a minute fraction of that. And I think that to
Right.
me, in a macro sense, that's kind of one of the problems is that there are lots of superheroes out there. And in fact, I would say like, you know what? Getting through the day trying to do the right thing is a heroic thing in its own right. I mean, I'm sure there are many days when just the average parent out there should be lauded as a superhero for getting through. Getting your kids to sleep at night is
I know,
is
right?
heroic.
I made dinner.
Yeah. No, but see, I think like you have to step up to the challenges given to you, and I think that's the part, and I think that's the great part about all the graphic novels or like you're talking about the sequential storytelling, whatever, where it's like it's not superheroes per se, it's more about everyday people. Is that a right way to describe it? Like, is it more like you're able to tell more? It's not superhero stuff; it's more everyday people that you're talking about.
I mean, a lot of publishing that's done through our imprint is, we do some fantasy, but it is about a lot about people. It is a
Mm.
lot of stories, or, uh, um, whether it's the perspective of somebody growing up in their with their specific hand of cards, or it's something in history that needs more attention to it. But yeah, it's it really is I do like what we publish, because a lot of it is like very it's to get to know get to know the world around you better kind of publishing.
Yeah. Do graphic novels? I mean, I guess the ones that you're doing do they like if a lot of the superheroes comic books are always centered around like New York City. Do graphic novels kind of are they like do they take place in lots of different areas, or do they tend to kind of be in a suburb or in the cities?
Oh, anywhere. I mean, it's
Yeah.
to wherever you can, whatever you can write a prose book about, you can do a graphic novel about.
Mhm.
And it's great. They're just you know, uh it's the accessibility. It's allowing, the story to reach a broader audience. And so yeah, and it's great.
Mhm. And do you think we are becoming more of a visual society?
I do. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like, that there's still yeah, it's interesting. I think it's I guess I'm trying to think of it in the sense of like how different was it when I was a kid. Um
Well, there was less comic books, and like I think you had more books, and whatever you were seeing on TV was going to be, there's only however many channels, six, seven, eight channels, and to the extent you're using a computer, it wasn't as
yeah.
graphically appealing, and like the DOS print, like the typing, it wasn't that you had different fonts. It was only with Macintosh where you started getting different fonts, and it made it more appealing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about how different it is now that we have cell phones that, like seemingly it's like an entire library in your pocket, and I think, yeah, there's an accessibility that's with us now that we, it's just unimaginable, what's crazy though is that you can, communication though between people is still largely with text. It's like you write an Instagram post, it's going to have a picture, but it's going to have, text that's sort of setting it up and explaining what's happening in the picture. Twitter is, again, like a lot of text and communication that's happening. I feel like, the written word is definitely there. But yeah, with cell phones and the cameras, yeah, yeah,
Well, the I think part of what gets the communication is also, I think, like how what you're communicating to somebody. And I'll back up. Last week we had to kind of, during the holiday break, we had to kind of clean up our apartment. So we were going through these boxes that we had of these postcards and stuff. And like we have postcards from friends, like from like the 90s and the early aughts, and like postcard is kind of like what we do now on Facebook when you're on vacation. Is kind of similar, like, hey, this is where I am. But the difference was when somebody spent time writing a postcard, they were thinking about you, like during that 15
right,
minutes of sitting down with that postcard, that graphic image showing off where they are, which maybe they're doing, but they're thinking of you. So when you get that, you're like, oh, they were thinking about me this whole time. Like I was on their mind. Even if they're
right,
talking to you about what they were doing, they're
right,
probably going to pepper it with some comment about, hey, I thought of you here, or how are you doing? And I think when you post a picture of your vacation, there's no communication about I'm thinking about you. So there's a less focus. And I
hmm,
think it also comes down to like effort. Like sometimes like even with like my family, like I might post I might write a text, like I could just say woo when somebody has good news, or I can go seek out one of those kind of like little gifs and then choose the
hmm,
right gif that sounds a little bit funnier. And I think that there's a communication about the time it took for me to choose that particular thing.
right.
And I don't know quite where we're going with that, but it's funny how like there's like nuance to even the images you choose. Does it look like you work to get that image, or did you just go with like the default smiley face? Like it says something, like, oh, that's a funny one. That's Will Farrell doing something silly versus just Daddy sending the smiley face.
Well, it's interesting. There's sort of like a, or sort of like a remote control side of things, right? You had to put forth a fair amount of effort to send that postcard. You had to buy the postcard. You had to make sure you had a pen available. You had to make sure you had that person's address on hand, or you had to remember it, and
Yes.
that multi-lined address, and then you had to get the stamp, and
Yep.
then you had to put that in the
Yes.
mail.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had to
Yeah.
find the mailbox. Where was that
Yes.
mailbox? But like now we have that remote controlled ability to then send messages to people like considerably easier and without all that hugabaloo. You can just start typing an email and it will autofill, and then you can just press a button and the person will get it within seconds. And then if you want to try to get in touch with a bunch of people, you can use that remote controlled ability to, reach your 500 followers or your, 5,000 followers,
Yeah.
um, I think it's interesting because, you know, when thing it's funny, I talk about this in the context of some of the things I have to do at work. Like there's some things I have to do that I purposefully want to do it by hand because I will remember it more that way. It's like you make the effort, it's gonna stick. But there's a similar headspace with this. It's like when things become too easy, they kind of
Meaning.
lose their meaning a bit. And I
Yeah.
think there's so much has been happening. What with like all this technology and ability to reach people, sometimes it comes too easy. Like I think, like there's something that said like, like just because you could send a message to somebody who's, you know, in another state, how about going to that other state, or,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
about actually, you know, you know, doing even this,
Yeah.
doing a video call with that person in another state. It's like there's a when things come too easy, I think like people take things for granted.
Yeah. It means less.
Yeah.
I mean, and
So
just by definition, and I think like if you're on vacation and you're by some place that makes you think of somebody, and you take a picture of you at that place and then you text it to them, that means a lot more than if you just post some random thing on Facebook.
right. Yeah.
So yeah, no, so it's interesting. I mean, but I think it is. There's so much more, and it got me thinking about like the Egyptians and hieroglyphics, and like and that's and emojis are kind of like that. I mean, it's like this like nonverbal, like there's just a drawing. How do you describe what does a smiley face mean? And in the
Yeah.
context of your message, it can mean any number of things,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
It's a little.
necessary too, because how much is lost when you only communicate with like letters.
What was wild is like when emojis really started out with texts, they like with the you know QWERTY phones, where you had
Yeah.
to hit one 3 times to get a C.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Like that was like great because it added like that little bit of like emotional information that you needed from a really truncated piece of
Yeah.
information, like, are you here? Smiley face. Oh, you're
Yeah.
happy wondering if I'm here. Are you here? Frowny face. Oh crap. It's like, like there's a lot that was given, but it's funny how like emojis have like turned into like this whole other thing. It kind of cracks me up.
Did you do any of your, I guess you're the people that write your graphic novels, or do they ever work emojis? Like, do you see any kind of change in the written additions to the graphic novels?
Say that question again.
I mean, are emojis or some form of emojis or symbolic communication working their way into graphic novels?
I mean, in that you're looking at the character faces. I mean, it kind of goes back to earlier in that, in the way that you're using that emoji to communicate exaggerated information like, oh geez, I'm not feeling well, and you have the emoji like with the like puking. It's like you're showing that visual cue information in the format, but it's integrated and part of the storyline.
Yeah.
No one's actually using like emojis. I mean,
Yeah.
not unless
Okay.
they're showing like someone texting or something like
Yeah.
that. But
The Japanese manga, I think I know, like from what I've read, the Drops of God, there are times when like the person's face, if they're really happy, it almost becomes an emoji. Now that you're talking about it,
yeah, those are like little chibis.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah, that's kind of like a way to kind of like show like an emotional change of like, someone gets like really embarrassed, they'll
yes,
have them go like, oh, and it's like
yeah,
that, like kind of, it's brilliant because it's almost perfectly replicating what that would really feel like in real life. Of like, someone calls you out on something and you get really embarrassed. It's like a whole body change. It feels like, and you're like, oh my God, I'm really embarrassed, and
yeah,
they kind of show that in that style. It's fun.
yeah, yeah. Oh, well, we could definitely go on a lot longer about this, but I'm sure you've probably got to get ready for your children to come home, and I know I have
Oh
to get
yeah.
ready for my children to come home. We made it this far, so why
I
push
know,
our
right?
luck? So, but yeah, before we wrap up, can I ask, like, what gives you hope at the end of the day?
I have to say it's watching my kids, and watching their friends. There's a definite amount of they're able to see things in a way that I was never able to see when I was their age, and they're wiser for it. So, those little rascals, man.
The world's gonna be theirs one way or the other.
I know, right?
So, all right. Well, Kirk, thanks so much for doing this. It's been a lot of fun. I'm glad we could share the conversation and time.
Same. This was a lot of fun. Thanks,
Yeah,
man.
all right, thank you, and thank you to everybody out there. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right, thanks so much.